Hi, my name is Rowan Williams, and I'm going to be talking to you today about writing their story, writing trans and non-binary characters. If you're tuning into this, it's likely because you're either somebody who writes these sorts of characters or would like to write these sorts of characters, or maybe you're just curious about the type of work that goes into representing otherwise marginalized groups like gaming companies. Through years of writing for games, I've spent a lot of that time queer coding characters for more public consumption. But right now, I like to think the current climate is one that promotes active representation instead of passive. And what I mean by that is that things like queer coding or writing characters that are obviously queer in one regard or another don't quite do the trick anymore. We want to see characters that are everywhere on the LGBTQ plus spectrum, and we want them to be open about it. It's also not as good to have characters in games that don't specifically work to represent a marginalized group of people, but do allow for opportunities to, for example, not choose a gender, but rather focus on a set of features, or allow you to date anyone regardless of what presentation or sexuality potentially that you've chosen for yourself. Or, for example, you get to choose from a couple of options that are still fairly limited in terms of gender or sexual representation. That said, these choices aren't insignificant. They're just better ways and more inclusive ways to focus on representation. As it currently stands, I'm personally attempting to work on much more meaningful, active representation, so characters that are, if you'll forgive the phrase, queer out loud. This doesn't mean that they need to shout from the rooftops things that we wouldn't discover about them through the natural course of conversation anyway, but being able to openly say, hey, this character's trans, or this character's non-binary, or this character's gay. We see their stories and recognize them for who and what they are. They represent us, the creators. I've had the immense privilege of working on Tyari the Traveler at Riot, who is Riot's first openly transgender character. I think I met with a lot of success there in many senses, and I was lucky that the audience took to her so well. Legends of Runeterra is a card game, which has a couple of difficult aspects. The first being that cards need to stay evergreen, as in their narrative can't change significantly because the card itself is static. That said, we told Tyari's story over a series of cards, wherein she goes from being a female human to kind of like a celestial demigod sort of being. And aside from my main project, I'm also working on A Long Journey to an Uncertain End, which has among its main cast a trans character and a non-binary character. So I've been able to apply a lot of my learnings to those characters and how they choose to talk about and represent their identities. Not to break away too much from the topic at hand, but inevitably with an RPG wherein there's branching choices, we'll get the opportunity to tell a lot more of a story than a card that has 20-something barks all told, card art and text that appears beside the final image. This is great, and both myself and the team are really able to dig into the stories we can tell with the Long Journey crew. So, how do we write these characters? Not just in a way that's representative, but is authentic. That's absolutely the most crucial detail. Being authentic often means telling the story associated with lived experiences, in which case I want to talk first about some of the technical stuff and the steps that it took to approach this for the very first time with a AAA studio. I want to caveat up front that obviously this is the situation with a AAA studio. It's not quite the same as what's going on with indie games, which is good and bad. AAA studios have the chance to push through to a global market in so many ways that an indie studio often doesn't, often as a result of financing. But indie studios are able to take many more risks without fear of a giant publisher saying no. Not always the case, of course, but a strong point in favor of making a character so visible. And for context, Tyari is a spellcaster in a magical universe where the most tech is basically steampunk. What we did is take this character, who presents as generally pretty masculine at first, and put them on a series of cards that detail their journey with two other people. The effort of this is to climb a magical mountain, which many people do, not only to prove their worth, but to seek power. And in Tyari's case, actually, it was a journey of self-discovery. The climb isn't a metaphor for transition, it's a metaphor for self-actualization. And the transition at the top to being the traveler is basically the way to honor her journey because she's a heroine. Looking back at the development process, I joined Riot at the end of 2018 when Tyari was first in development. Obviously, that's already such a long time ago, or at least it feels like it. But there were a definitive series of steps that I took to tell Tyari's story, and I hope that I can illuminate them. So first and foremost, I did the research. This may seem obvious if you're writing on a topic you're not familiar with, but even as a trans person myself, and I wasn't out at the time, I was just a very staunch advocate, which will probably cause those of you who are trans in the audience to have a giggle. I can't claim to know all there is about what it is to be trans. The culture is not only one that's constantly changing with updated language, there are a lot of points of contention within it. And that's not to say we're a divisive lot, but situations vary a lot from person to person. And I'm hardly the most qualified to say what goes and what doesn't. This is just to say there's a lot of various factors involved. So it took reading through resources not only for allies, but for people who are going through the process of transitioning. I talked to my workmates next. There were a lot of people involved in the pipeline, artists, designers, other narrative people. I was fortunate in that I brought it up to my leads, and instead of just getting the go-ahead, I got people who said to me, we think this is a great idea and a story worth telling, so how can we help you? Getting buy-in and help from the people that I was working with was tremendous. It can't be overstated, the importance of having that support. And in my case, my narrative lead at the time, Mel Lee, had a tremendous impact on the overall success of this story due to her diligence and advocacy on my behalf. I also did some personal research, which is to say I very kindly and in an NDA-friendly way solicited information from my friends. Why? Because my friends are more likely to be willing to do the emotional labor. And I did check with them first before engaging and just bombarding them with questions. But I know that I can trust them to be honest with me. Not just because, of course, they want good representation, but because specifically in the case of Tyari, I was able to ask, does a magical transition feel like it's doing transitioning in general a disservice? Does it feel too unreal? Is it too ridiculous of a circumstance? Then I consulted with some work peers. I was very fortunate to have already made a few friends within my team who were trans, and when I told them about my ideas and presented my very rough proposal, they were able to help me smooth out some of the rougher edges and make sense of a story that felt more authentic and true to life, as opposed to strictly fantastical. That was a huge boon, and I'm very grateful to them as well. I started to write some stuff up using all that I'd learned at that point. I did a rough draft of the script, ran it past said work peer, got buy-in from my narrative peers on the team, and then when it was in an okay place, I ran it past an interest group within the company. The group was actually put together specifically for the purpose of giving feedback on the character. And you may ask why this is so important, because again, these people want to see themselves accurately represented, and they also have the goal of the product in mind. We coordinated with talent as well. We looked into opportunities to have trans mask or non-binary people voice Tyari, who then turns into the Traveler, because we didn't want to ask someone to do something they were uncomfortable with at the very least, but might be triggered by or become dysphoric about at the worst. But when we put out the call for actors and for talent, we really were so fortunate that Maddie Taylor, actually the voice of Tyari, was willing to access her masculine range to play the part. We also coordinated with publishing and with localization. Localization in the sense that we gave a heads up to the people involved in different regions because they would know the best way to represent this. And I want to say also at this time in Riot's history, we had to be extra careful. Again, this is back in 2018, kind of beginning of 2019. LGBTQ plus content is illegal in many places where Riot games are published. So for my part, I had to be aware of that. And if you notice, there are no pieces of VO or writing where Tyari says, I become the Traveler, or the Traveler says, I used to be Tyari, despite the fact that it's very strongly implied. We also checked with that internal group one last time just to get any red flags cleared up. Was there something deliberately offensive about the material? Was something not clear? Was there any semblance of an actual transition going on here? Was the story clear enough to read for people who were looking at it? And was it clear enough for those who might make the connection otherwise? I think some of this is good and some of this is bad. In retrospect, I wish I had called it out the two are one and the same. I feel it would have been more fitting, served the needs of the trans community more. And I also at the time justified that the Traveler wasn't extra femme in her appearance because I didn't think that did service to transition. We don't just get to instantly pop into the body we want. Transitioning takes a long time and it's hard work, just like the allegory of climbing this magical mountain. I also wish that we had done a better job of representing her as a female at the end, because so many trans and non-binary characters are represented as non-human that this felt kind of bad. All this to say that Tyari was more or less a hit. I don't say that lightly either. When people recognized her for what she was, over 1,000 people commented on a subreddit post. That's a ton. And not including people who didn't engage on the topic or posted elsewhere, just enjoyed the content as it was. So whether or not she was perfect, people loved her. And she wasn't perfect. I know that. I desperately wish she could have been, but I'm proud of her nonetheless. So this is my advice to you. Follow some of the same methods. Personal research, then subjective research, then objective if you can. Getting peer feedback and reaching out to possible third parties without a personal stake in the company or the product's success. And I know this is a ton of work. It's so rigorous, and you're right. It is. And it's worth it to be so invested and take so many risks, because you'll get a better sense for the flow and have the knowledge in your head for the next time you do it on basically any issue of DE&I. Is this the only right way of doing it? No. Is it a successful way of doing it? I think the metrics speak for themselves. Our culture is constantly shifting and evolving, including all manner of marginalized people, in which case this work changes? Absolutely. But that's what makes us writers. And I work with a lot of different writers, right? Not everyone is going to be present in the room, especially when it comes to matters of intersectionality. I truly believe that marginalized people should be penning the thing for themselves when they're able to. For example, it's incredibly important that Black people write Black characters, trans people write trans characters. Are those writers always going to be the ones with opportunities to write those characters? Sadly, no, though we can and should source them when we're able. And do writers of intersectional backgrounds exist? Absolutely. So you should talk to them when you can. What I am saying is that you should treat this not like the author of the thing, but the channel for it. You don't have the lived experience to lend to the story, the people you're actively trying to represent too. Yours is the hand that wields the pen. Yours is the brain that makes the words good. Yours is the heart that motivates you to try and stay true and as authentic as possible to the story. But the story is not your own. It's theirs. And that's why you're helping to write their story, so that people see themselves in your work, so that you speak to an audience far broader than one you could reach through only your own experiences, so that people feel seen and heard and recognized. You will be a better writer for it. You can find me on Twitter at @RWilliams. You're welcome to reach out to my personal email at ro.noel@gmail.com. Connect with me on LinkedIn. You can wishlist a long journey to an uncertain end on Steam and play Legends of Runeterra via playruneterra.com. Thanks for your time and attention. Enjoy the rest of LudoNarraCon.